Chapter 24. In Like Flynn. The tone of Hollywood's scandals changed when in 1942, Errol Flynn was charged with statutory rape. Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, the girls involved, were under 18. One claimed to be raped by land, one by sea. Charming, easygoing Flynn had been one of Hollywood's best-liked figures, off and on screen, ever since his swashbuckling image had been fixed as Captain Blood. He was born in Tasmania, and after a rowdy boyhood during which he was thrown out of many schools there and in Australia, made a strong impression as Fletcher Christian in The Wake of the Bounty, the first Bounty film. After several unremarkable roles in England and Hollywood, he hit the jackpot with Captain Blood and went on to become one of Warner's top stars in such films as The Adventures of Robin Hood. He became an idol of the young in movies which were obviously fun to make and even more fun to watch, and which usually included the rescue of a pretty girl, most often Olivia de Havilland, at the end of a long pointed sword. That's called a rapier, by the way. Women of all shapes and ages could not resist running after magnetic Errol. His stormy marriage to sultry, bisexual Lily Demita came to an end in 1942. One evening that year, a rather comic scene was enacted in the living room of Flynn's Mulholland Drive home. A police officer had come to inform the swashbuckler, who could have bawled nearly any chick who tickled his fancy, that he was charged with statutory rape. Flynn claimed he didn't even know that there was such an animal. It was explained to him that a California law forbade carnal knowledge of anyone under 18, even with their consent. Getting seduced by an underage chick could cost you 5 years in the jug. The cops had picked up Betty Hansen, a young girl, for vagrancy. Among many interesting items in her possession were the phone numbers of Flynn and his pal, Bruce Cabot, who had saved Fay Wray from King Kong. Betty claimed that a tennis match with the guys had been followed by a swim and sex party. She said Flynn had undressed, but had kept his socks on throughout. Okay, I'll be honest, that's a little gross to me. Flynn denied the accusation, admitted to having seen Betty at a party and nothing more. He was booked and released on bail. On returning home, the actor's phone rang. An unknown voice said, "Tell Jack I want $10,000, and hung up. The entire affair might have been dropped then and there if Jack Warner, Flynn's boss, had returned the extortionist's call. The DA did not seem to have a case, but for reasons best known to himself, would not let Flynn go peaceably about his career, which at that point involved personifying one of America's great sports heroes, Gentleman Jim. The fuzz then dragged in a dancer from the Florentine Gardens, Peggy Satterlee. She was well known around town, but because of her obvious experience in mammoth knockers, no one suspected that this minor tootsie was anything but a major pro. Peggy claimed that Errol had taken her aboard his yacht, the Sirocco, in 1941 and had bawled her in front of every porthole. Headlines not only in the States but around the world proclaimed, "Robin Hood charged with rape." The fans nearly rioted when Flynn arrived to face the grand jury, but what had promised to be a feature-length courtroom sex drama turned out to be a one-reel farce. In Rashomon fashion, Betty, Peggy, and Errol each told a different version of the facts. The jury went out and came back with a quick vindication of Flynn. It seemed that the affair was closed. Flynn went home, opened a case of champagne, and friends and well-wishers came by to celebrate. The studio breathed a sigh of relief. Jim was still a gentleman. Then, to everyone's amazement, the district attorney's office, in a rarely used procedure, overrode the decision of the grand jury and decided to prosecute the star in spite of his acquittal. The studio brought in Jerry Geisler, or Giesler. I'm going to say Geisler, considered Hollywood's shrewdest attorney, to defend Flynn. Geisler wisely advised Flynn to prepare for a long trial. The best defense was attack, and even if long drawn-out proceedings would prove a nuisance, as the trial progressed, the expression "in like Flynn" became a GI code word which amused more than annoyed its namesake. It would give Geisler time to shatter the girls' credibility by raking up everything that could be found about their tacky pasts, and there was plenty to rake. Peggy went into great detail about what was supposed to have gone on aboard the Sirocco, but in doing so she overreached herself, and Geisler was able to pick her version of the facts apart. And why had she waited a whole year to discover she had been raped? The judge had to bring to court the order when she recounted Flynn's whispering in her ear that moon would look more beautiful through a porthole. When Betty Hansen took the stand and testified that Flynn had taken off her clothes, Geisler charged like the cavalry. First, he got her to admit that she had permitted the disrobing, then he thundered at her, "Didn't you want him to take them off?" Betty's disarming reply won the day for Flynn. "I didn't have no objections." Errol Flynn was acquitted on all 4 counts. Gentleman Jim, released shortly after, turned out to be one of Flynn's finest vehicles, pleasing critics and public alike. This movie star scandal, which only 10 years previously would have surely meant a career death, canceled contracts, and public dishonor, even if the main character had been acquitted, did not work out that way this time. Morality had shifted. Identifying fans like the idea of being in like Flynn and turned out in droves for the movie. Morality had evolved so much by these wartime years that the Flynn case would never have been brought to court had it not been for concealed pressure, not pressure from the public. The papers could not go into the underside of the affair at the time, but it soon became apparent to everyone involved, to Flynn, Geisler, and Warner Brothers, that the persecution of Flynn was traceable to corrupt Los Angeles politicians who had decided that the studios, after a shaky period during the Depression, were now making a fortune with wartime escapist entertainment movies and were not, it seemed to them, coming across with juicy enough kickbacks. These payoffs had been habitually turned over to the bosses, who would make sure that the police got its cut of the take. They, in turn, protected the studios by dropping charges in case stars got into any sort of trouble. The Flynn Mountain wouldn't have remained a molehill except that shortly before it broke, some changes had been made in the chain of command at L.A. City Hall. When Jack Warner had failed to cough up to the new bosses, the first rape charge against Flynn had been brought up as a warning. When that could not be sustained, the second chippy was pushed forward by the cops to chirp her year-old charges. Fortunately for Flynn, the jury, Geisler had made sure that 9 of the 12 were women, did not buy the police's trumped-up case, and Errol Flynn was free to delight his fans with more good flicks and to enjoy 20 more years of carousing. That is the end of this chapter.